All right, we're on a pretty tight time schedule, so I'm going to go ahead and kick this off. My name is Robert Golightly. I'm a part of the marketing team for the Asset Performance Management Business Unit at AspenTech. In hindsight, I'm not sure what my state of mind was when I put this thing together, looking back. I mean, think about it. Let's do a presentation right after lunch when everybody's sleepy, and let's throw the word governance in the title and see what happens. I was working on this at the house, and my wife of almost 46 years took one look at it, and she looks at me and she says, "Ooh, scintillating." Great way to sort of deflate your ego. But I'm a stubborn old fart, so away we go. At the basis of what I'm going to talk about today is the fundamental value proposition around this predictive maintenance thing. And I'm going to show that while there are certainly local benefits local to the maintenance department, they're dwarfed by the opportunities on the operational side. And so I think one of the things about that early and accurate warning capability that we're delivering is the ability to do those cross-functional interventions before the failure of the machine. The most valuable thing any of us possess is time, and with more time, anything is possible. I've watched this technology adoption movie a few times in the last 40 years, but this one seems to be on fast forward. A year ago, my colleague, Mike Brooks, who's lurking in the back of the room over there, I think was in this very room and doing a presentation on Intel and talking about its capabilities. And if I think back to all of the questions that he fielded, there was one sort of fundamental question, tell me about your model. The market was so conditioned to believe that these predictive technologies needed some sort of a rigorous or statistical model underneath it, and through residuals analysis, we sort of figure out what's wrong. And he spent a great deal of time sort of talking about why that's not what we're doing. There's no model there. And so I think that in the course of that conversation, we've been able to convince a significant portion of the market. If not, Mr. Brooks is in the back of the room. His string is located right here. Just give it a pull, and I'm sure he'll give you a convincing argument about why you ought to be thinking about this in a different way. So we go from that conversation a year ago to, is this really possible? And everybody wanted to know, have you done it on this specific unit? Because of that underlying conversation about the model. And when we were here last year, hot off the presses, and by that I mean our events people were down at the FedEx business office printing this thing off when we were doing the workshop, we presented a case study on one of these hypercompressors that comes out of LDPE production. And we were sort of showing the fact that there are multiple failure types and significant notification of those failures. And we went on to talk to a number of customers about this. There are some 270 of these things in the world. And as we talked to those customers, they all had the same problem. These things break down, if you look at the main part of the distribution, somewhere between 6 and 18 times a year. And in one extreme case, a lot more than that. And yet, when I started out, I said, the benefits on the maintenance side were sort of dwarfed by the operational benefits, and that's a huge spread, and I'm going to come back to that in just a few minutes. And we also went on to talk about the fact that this isn't a one-trick pony. There's no model hiding under the hood, so this has much broader applicability. But beyond that, more importantly, it has scalability and the ability to roll quickly. And so a year later, remarkably, at least in the conversations that I'm engaged with, there's still some of that can you do it conversation, and that'll linger for several years. But by far and large, the conversation is shifting. 2 or 3 years ago, when we talked to executives, their question was, what is this digital thing and why do I care? And from where we are today, with pretty effective strategies, and this is a slide by one of the management consultancies, Bain & Company, and I'm not really here to beat their drum, I just sort of like the way they did this. I don't know if they're really smart or if they just have a really good marketing guy. But I like the way that they presented this. I mean, this is, right out of our book, right? That perfect plant making the process and the supply chain and the workforce work together. But the thing I really like is this one, that maintenance and optimize operating conditions, because that's sort of our point of view about this. Until you're looking at both, you're never going to get that high fidelity signal that tells you what's really going on. So there's lots and lots and lots of opportunity in this thing. And when you see these guys, you know blood's in the water. And so you look at companies like Ceres, talk about asset intensive, huge scope, global company. And very quickly, they drank the Kool-Aid and developed a strategy. And their strategy embodied a lot of the things that you've heard already in the course of this event. Run, don't walk, those kinds of things. And so almost all of these strategies that we're seeing have this element of try lots of things quickly, throw lots of seeds, see what takes root, and do something about it. What I really like about theirs is that they ground a lens to look through in terms of opportunities so that they understand what value they're trying to find, and they focus that lens on a particular set of assets. But what I'm enamored of is they had a reason for doing it. They wanted to transform an entire sort of work process. And this is a recurring theme, and it goes back to what I said at the beginning of the power predictive is in its ability to do those cross-functional things. That's where the value is. And so a couple of things about some of the recent engagements that we've had, because I think it's sort of inferential proof of the mindset of the market with respect to some of these predictive analytics. We've had customers that said, why should we waste time doing a pilot? Let's go right to something that's going to deliver some value. Let's skip that and get right to an adoption thing. This is a business, we're primarily in the continuous process industry, so bulk chemicals, refining, polymers, those kinds of things. They're not known as fast-moving markets, right? It's a 10-year technology adoption cycle. It's a 9 to 18-month sales cycle. And yet things are compelling enough that we've had instances of a complete transaction from hi, howdy to purchase order in 90 days. That's a pretty good inferential of the stickiness in the market. I think the other thing that's radically different is that as a longtime marketer, I've been guilty of a little puffery in my day too, but the lies being cast in this market a year or two ago were just shocking. And I think the market's sort of woken up to some of that, and so a lot of the people that were sort of the dominant competitors in this landscape aren't even, quote, in the room. And if you're not in the room, you're not in the deal. So the other thing that's different is that customers are going from these early seedling projects to rollouts very quickly. We had a recent conversation with a customer where we were going back and pitching a rollout plan. We thought we were being pretty aggressive. We didn't want to sound crazy, but we had a fairly aggressive schedule. And the customer stops us and says, look, I like this, but you need to go away, come back, and tell me how to do this in a third of the time. So I think that what we're seeing is that there are a number of our customers that are pretty far down the journey. They're very practical and pragmatic about it all. They have a plan, and they're working that plan. And I know that there was, you did, I think, a presentation on Monday on this whole change management thing. And Peter, I know that you've written about this as well. And I just remembered that I forgot my manners, and I didn't introduce my panelists, Polly Hollywood and Peter Reynolds. I don't know if you've read their work, but I compliment Peter a lot, so I'll switch and pick on you. Some of the things that I read about your background are just intimidating. You've kind of had your hands on a lot of things. So my question to you is, what are you guys seeing in terms of these general trends in these digital strategies? You want to start?
Sure. Sometimes I think that we get in analysis paralysis, and we're not really looking for the value. What is the value? Even as consumers, we have people trying to sell us stuff all the time. And sometimes I'll admit I'm distracted and I'll indulge. But then it comes down to, well, this was really a waste of money. Why did I do that? What was the purpose behind that, and what was I thinking? And I think that in the end user community, there obviously you're inundated with people knocking on your door and trying to sell you things all the time. But you really have to have that discerning attitude and really decide what your problem is, how you want to solve it, and really seek and work with someone who's willing to help you solve it, not just the bright and shiny object. So be more discerning would be my advice from the get-go.
Peter?
Thanks, Paul and Robert. So It's interesting. I've been coming to the ARC Forum for relatively small number of years, about 8 years, and maybe a few years before that as a past customer. We used to talk about automation and control and safety and a lot of things that are really important. But I look around the audience and I look at the companies that are at this ARC event, and it really is different. Like, we're really, really talking about a different use of data. And I was pleased to be invited as an analyst to support Robert on this topic of data governance, because I think it's really important. Because not only are we changing what our customers of data are doing, but we're really changing the approaches of how we implement technology. So I spent a lot of time working in chemicals and oil and gas and pulp and paper and some of the process companies that use technology, and there are a lot of gaps. Everybody's working on analytics. Everybody has a digital transformation project. They're all piloting technology, and many of them are getting stuck. Right? So some of the trends that we see in industry, there are aspects of change leadership that are missing. And I think back to the first time when we went to put advanced process control in front of an operator, and we said, "Here you go. Did you get the email? Now turn it on." Right? So really, we're talking about a major shift. We're talking about machine learning, where probabilistic recommendations go to an operator where he may look at, there's an 82% chance of a piece of equipment failing in the next 90 days, right? That's a completely different mind shift. So what I'm seeing in industry is really companies are really, really focusing on the human side of change and how to make it happen in your company, because it's just not all about the technology.
No.
Yep.
If I may just.
No, absolutely.
Excuse me, if you think about the discrepancy in dollars that Robert had on the screen, excuse me, I'm finding a lot of people are really not recognizing what asset performance management is all about. And in my opinion, it is more about operations and maintenance working together, because it's not just about maintenance and it's not just about operations. It's working together for the goals of the company. And if you think about using the information, that data as an asset, in a lot of cases now is exceeding the value of the asset itself if you look at its value to the organization over the life cycle of the asset. So it would really behoove us to use that more wisely and to mine that and manage it, because if you don't, you won't get the value from it. So it is a valuable asset. So take care of it and use it to your advantage.
Great comments. So one of the other differences, a year ago it was all about, is it possible? And we were showing you 1 or 2 studies, and fast forward a year and you look at the things that have gone on in the market and how quickly customers are jumping on these opportunities. Unlike anything I've seen in my career, but the desire to scale up quickly can't be underestimated. So my answer is yes, it can be done. It's actually to the point now that it takes me longer to write up a case study and do battle with the lawyers than it does to do the projects. So other things to notice about this, look at the range of industries, particularly this one, where if you're doing a model-based approach, you're probably in pretty bad shape because there's not a lot of models, that equipment out there. You look across the rest of these and then look at the lead time that we're providing, and these are fairly accurate signals, right? There's not this, we're not plagued by these false alarms that you see in these other technologies. So what a difference a year makes, right? So, but again, if you're not a believer, pull Mike's string and give us another shot and we'll try to get you on board. So, and it's a global phenomenon. And then usually you sort of see these things in kind of regional waves. And to some degree that's true. We sort of began our effort in Europe, so it's sort of logical that pops to the top. But it really is global, and even to the point that we're bringing partners into the organization to implement these things. So the adoption rate is accelerating. Customers are impatient. They want it right now. And so, as you've heard many ways, this path to digital transformation has to focus on a problem to solve. This is not just an exercise in making technical propeller waft. There needs to be a compelling business reason why we go after these. And even in something like the chemical industries, which began its digital journey 25 years ago, there are still some fairly huge opportunities out there, especially, to Paula's point, this sort of cross-functional, let's play nice together in a sandbox kind of a thing, because that's where the value is going to be delivered. And so also last year we presented, this case study around this hypercompressor thing, and the thing that made me all misty-eyed was why they were doing it. Yes, they wanted to improve their maintenance and drive their maintenance costs down and all of that, but they really wanted to transform their fulfillment process and stop late orders to customers. So they had a very aspirational, big idea in mind, and that's common in the successful strategies that we're seeing. And my personal opinion is that this whole cross-functional thing plays a very important role in this chart, which is sort of showing, based on not quite so nebulous metric of total shareholder return, looking at the performance of companies across regions, across industry types, and it looks kind of like a shotgun blast. And I think a lot of these differences are in the way that we make those decisions and work cross-functionally, and it's not maybe as much with sort of local improvements to one function or another, but how we all play nice together. And so there's this notion that our ability to orchestrate these workflows in a new way, driven by these predictive analytics, offers a huge opportunity. And so back to my original proposition that the value of this thing is in the cross-functional interventions. And I started off talking about an LDPE case, and I said there's this huge spread in the benefits between the typical case and the worst case. Well, if you look at this thing, this is a production schedule for an LDPE plant. Every one of these unique colors and letters represents a different grade of plastic. They make everything from diapers to dashboards. And so the way they operate is they start at the top of the production wheel and they step their way down, right? You don't want to make big transitions because you make a lot of crap. And so what's depicted here is where our predictive maintenance solution has actually sent the predictions of downtime into the scheduling system, and we're able to rerun the optimization and minimize those missed orders. If you happen to have a breakdown that occurs at the wrong part in this sequence, you might be stuck with that rather long transition. And that's where a lot of that huge difference in benefit came from. And so here's a case where to really get the value, you had to have the maintenance department, the operations department, and the scheduling department singing Kumbaya. Not an easy thing to do, and goes directly to what she's talking about. The change management was the reason that I wanted to talk about governance, because I think this movie is playing at a rapid rate. I've seen it before. I think we've all been bitten by getting behind the curve, and I don't think we want to do that again. So let's get ahead of the curve on governance. And so if you've got your handy-dandy app and care to vote, I posed some questions, and I knew this was going to be dicey. But I don't even have the list of questions. I think the first one is that the success that we've seen in our customer accounts begins with that executive sponsorship, without which not. And so the whole polling thing was about, do you have executive sponsorship? And when we asked this question 2 years ago, that yes was flatline. And if you look at the difference today, companies have switched on and realized that without that nurturing and care on the executive side, you're not going to get anywhere. But there's still some room to go, right? So what a difference a couple of years makes. All right, and before that gets too out of skew, I'll jump ahead. This is another slide that's been done in various treatments by various folks. Again, I stole Bain because I like their graphics, but some other sort of important lessons in all of this, right? The skills that it takes to do these pilots, find those opportunities, throwing seeds, that's a particular skill set. It's probably not the skill set to worry about that scaling. So here's your first sort of organizational challenge. Let's move on. And you move here to this notion of a digital champion, which they call out as a part of that governance layer, right? The people here don't necessarily have the skills or the desire to swim in those shark-infested waters, so it's nice to have somebody in the organization that's willing to do that. And gee, wouldn't it be nice if they had some information to sort of inform those roadmaps? And all of it, at the center of everything, is this change management. So I really like this representation. I think it's just spot on in terms of an effective organization to go challenge this beast. Not the only one, but certainly an effective one. So the other question that I sort of asked on this, and let's see, of your digital initiatives, how many of them actually cross multiple workflows? Are all of your projects focused on individual departments and local benefits, or do they cross those workflows? I like that result. Is that one person voting? Thank you. But I think that, you know, it's a clear message that we're getting, is that you really have to think big picture on this to get the value. If you're pigeonholing this to the maintenance department, you're leaving a lot of money on the table. And so, again, if you're going to cross all of these business processes, then there are a number of issues in there, not the least of which is data. And so I'm going to pull Paula's string again and have you wax eloquent about the whole governance issue around that.
Well, it seems to me that it's pretty simple. If you're not managing your data and using it properly, it really is a stranded asset. And what is a value is that? It's not. You're actually just creating a digital island, and that's not useful. So you need to decide who has access to it, how are you going to share it, who are you going to share it with, who owns it, who's responsible for it. All of those things you need to think about, because it is the valuable asset that it is, so protect it as well as use it, but protect it.
Yep. You want to chime in on that?
Yeah, sure. Data is an interesting topic with respect to the future failure of some assets. And I don't know, I think that the industry is still settling on the term for this. You know, asset optimization, asset lifecycle optimization, asset performance management. But I really like the message that you started with, Robert, and that's about building a cross-functional team. And what I'd be really interested is, I saw the polling results, and I know a lot of maintenance or operations excellence projects will cross multiple domains, but I think we got something interesting taking place here with respect to the data that's used to predict a machine failure in the future, right? So a lot of historical applications have either looked at prognostics and lots of data that comes off the machine, or even some of the modern solutions, they just look at what data comes from the machine in order to perform some basic analytics or apply a machine learning algorithm to figure out when it's going to fail. But if you think about complex processes such as refineries and chemical plants and petrochemical, what happens in the process has got a tremendous impact on the future state of that asset. So from a data perspective, what's really interesting here is this data governance completely changes. Right? It's no longer a conversation about master data governance that's put into your SAP maintenance system or your Maximo system. You're really talking about the data that's in the process to help predict the failures. So the governance is very different, right? So we've got pressure, level, flow, temperature, product quality analyzers. We take all that data and put it into a process historian, and who has got data governance on that structure, right? The reality is not a whole lot of companies are doing it well. There are a few. So if you think about data governance, that also has to come together, and it historically has not. There's lots of governance around controls and access to historian system, but when it comes right down to it, sometimes instruments just don't work. Sometimes they don't get fixed. Right? We fix the instruments that are tied to real-time control and safety loops, or the ones that impact your mass balance, but we don't address the ones necessarily that are part of reliability. So this is where there's a big opportunity for companies to look at data governance, because it's not just about what's in SAP, it's now what's in your process historian system that you have to think about that, otherwise you're going to put garbage into your asset management strategy.
Great comment.
I just kind of think that we heard about convergence this morning, and everybody talks about OT, IT convergence. I like to add the ET in. We have a session on that Thursday. But in essence, I think you're saying cross-functional, and we're calling it convergence. So it's kind of the same thing.
Yep. Good. So the other question that I posed was, what are your C people telling you they want from all of this? What does the executive suite want from digital transformation? Is it the usual and customary cost savings, new rev, In particular, I'm enamored of the other category, because the answer that I expect from the other category is that big, hairy, audacious transform message, right? I don't want to just make sort of local improvements. I'm looking to transform my business, maybe be in a business that doesn't look anything like the business that I'm in today when I look up from 10 years. So these are big things. And for those of you that voted others, thank you for saving me. I thought that would turn out poorly. But I think the real question, and the whole motivation, at least for me in all of this, is how digital transformation is going to impact the C-suite. We know how the C-suite impacts digital transformation, without which not, right? But when you look at the information that they operate off of, and I'm going to throw some stones here, I think a lot of the information that they use is fairly high latency, low fidelity, yet directionally correct sort of KPIs. What happens to governance when you have this advanced notice of everything? So what do we think should be the impact? And I think this is a conversation that we need to have. I don't think we've talked about it. I don't think we know the answers. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us that are in this transformation thing to go have that conversation with the executives and make sure that there's something in it for them. Because my view of this is that if we go through this transformation and it doesn't fundamentally change the way we make those big decisions, why did we do it? And so I think there will be a big impact. So some other things that we've sort of learned: choose those early projects carefully. And if you backed up a couple of years, Peter and I were talking last night, and he had this quip that I'm sure I'll butcher, but he's basically saying, predictive analytics were like teenagers having sex. They're all claiming to do it. Not very many of them are, and the ones that aren't doing it very well. So, fast forward to where we are now, and we're starting to see some pretty impressive things in these programs. But choose wisely, and choose those early projects for the ability to influence the organization. It's not just about the technology success. You're doing a cultural transformation, and you have to get them to believe. So give them a reason to believe. Choose those projects very carefully. Avoid the science projects. Don't do the hardest thing you can possibly imagine as your first project out of the gate. And we had some silly stuff in sort of the early days. We actually had customers going in and doing things like mislabeling data intentionally just to try to sort of trip us up. But, play a straight game. Choose your project carefully. Throw a lot of seeds. Try a lot of things, but do it with a little bit of oversight, right? Grind that lens and focus it on the assets you think are going to deliver the real value, and provide those people with the things that they need to be successful. And then the next, and one of the largest, is assume you're going to be successful. And that means you've got a lot of planning to do. You should have a methodology for how you're going to look at these opportunities and how you're going to prioritize and how you're going to fund and resource. And maybe you do need to partner with somebody to pull this off, and you need to start having a conversation, because as like you saw in the rollout slide, once a seed starts to grow, they want it to grow quickly. And so we need to be ready for all of the governance around that. And then finally, the big one is that have that conversation about how your executives want digital transformation to impact their lives. And I think that's a really important conversation to have. And the reason that I think that's important is in the direction that I see things going. And so when we talk about things being prescriptive, the first question is, prescriptive with respect to what? And so when we look at things like prescriptive maintenance, that's prescriptive with respect to the asset and the maintenance process, right? All this conversation around digital twins, when you condense that down, digital twins are the intermediary between process automation and the operators, right? They're advising and providing counsel, getting them out of trouble and all of those kinds of things, right? Helping them make those decisions. But the one that I find the most interesting in all of this, now that we've actually climbed some of those hills, is this next one. If all of these benefits, the major benefits, are going to come from all of these cross-functional workflows, chances are we're going to be doing some sort of programmatic things through what I call procedural automation that allows me to wire workflows and business processes together. Now, before we just go off and do that for the fun of it, we probably ought to think about what we're actually doing if we're going to try to codify certain elements of our governance. And we ought to think about that fairly deeply and approach that with some degree of caution. But at least in my view of this, I think there will come a point in time within the next couple of years that this will be a dominant part of the conversation as we figure out how to wire these things together without making the same mistakes that we did in the 80s and 90s with a lot of point-to-point interfaces and a lot of the other silly stuff that we've done in the past. And so I think what I wanted to have come out of this was not only sort of share this information that we've learned in all of these engagements and to pose this question about the impact of transformation on the C-suite, but to start a conversation. There's a lot of work to be done. I think there's a lot of people that have skin in this game. I think when you look at these strategies, one of the things I really like is that emphasis on today forward, future back. Get some benefits today, but don't sacrifice your future or vice versa. So I think there's an awful lot for us to talk about, and luckily we have lots of channels to do that. I'm sure that you guys will start some conversations, and we will as well on our social channels, but we'd love to engage you in that conversation and hear what you have to think about all of this. And with that, I think we're ready for questions. Surely somebody has a question. My boss is in the room. Somebody have a question? Yes, sir. Yep. So when you look under the hood of a lot of these predictive maintenance solutions, the most common thing is a rigorous, engineering simulation model underneath there, right? And so you're taking real-time data from the plant, you're putting it through that model, you're looking at the residuals and trying to make sense of that, right? And whether that's a rigorous model or a statistical model, it's essentially the same. So first you have to have somebody that understands those models. If they exist, yay, and that'll last until the first time they need an update, right? If you don't have a model, you're in trouble, especially if you're going to try to scale this thing out. So the notion that you have to have that model of the asset is very, very different from the proposition that I'm simply going to use an asset I already have, decades of operational data, and I'm going to mine that data using machine learning. I'm going to find that signature that tells me I'm headed for the weeds. Very different than this notion of a model. Very hard to envision a 10,000 asset scale out in a modern enterprise where I'm forced to build models of all of those assets. So the huge fundamental difference in approach. Great question. Any others? Yes, sir. Well, so I'd put it this way. First and foremost, you need failures, right? So you need some history of at least one or two of these failures. You need some sort of process data. And in general, we sort of start with hourly data and we ratchet our way down if we have to. But by far and large, in the areas where we work, in the process industries, data is not really the issue. But I will say one other thing on that. We've had a number of customers that have gone into engagements with us and they make assumptions about the level of instrumentation that's required for this technology to work. And we've surprised them in a few cases. We can work with pretty skinny sensorial information. But so you want a history of those failures. You want to be able to correlate that with the process data. I use the analogy of the impact of the process on the asset is like the teenager driving your car. You need to know what he's doing behind that wheel. And so you just need information to reflect that. Others? No? All right. Here's one more.
Well, I guess I'll play devil's advocate here a little bit. I would challenge that response to the prior question about models. I would say both approaches are model-based. One is a first principles engineering model, and the other is a empirical or statistical model. But there's a model. When you're doing machine learning or any kind of AI, there is a model, and that model has to be trained by somebody. So, there is still a model involved, and it might have to be retrained if your process changes. You need to account for that as well.
But the model building process is radically different, right?
It's different, but there's still a model.
Well, I'd put it to you this way. Aspen invented the first rigorous engineering simulator for the chemicals industry. That was the basis of our company as we came out of MIT. We've been in that modeling business for 37 years. You'd think that would be the first tool we would have reached for when we started this, going into the asset performance management game. But we know what those challenges are. And so while you can make it work, can you scale it? Can you sustain it? So I appreciate your comment, and thank you for that, but I do think there are radical differences in the way you go about creating that representation in signatures versus a rigorous engineering model. Others? All right. Thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it.